In the vast expanse of the Galactic Educational Consortium, where beings from 1,000 worlds gather to learn the art of peaceful coexistence, there exists one universal truth that every species acknowledges. Never, under any circumstances, should you make a human smile when they're angry. The other students thought they understood predators.
The Kythara had razor-sharp claws and hunted in packs. The Vorthan could crush steel with their bare hands.
The Nexari possessed venom that could paralyze a full-grown elephantine in seconds. But none of them, not a single one, had ever encountered something quite like the human who walked into advanced xenobiology that day. Professor Zillith's tentacles quivered as she watched the new student take a seat in the back row. The human appeared deceptively fragile, with soft skin, small teeth, and what seemed like pathetically weak musculature. Most species would have dismissed him as prey. That was their first mistake. Because when Kareth the Destroyer, a 7-foot-tall apex predator from the savage world of Kronos, decided to establish his dominance over what he perceived as the weakest link in the class, he had no idea he was about to discover why humans were classified as Class X2 Deathworlders, and why their smile, when combined with the right circumstances, could make even the most fearsome predator in the galaxy question everything they thought they knew about the food chain. The lesson was about to begin, but it wouldn't be the one on the syllabus. The Galactic Educational Consortium's campus on Nexus Prime stretched across 3 continents and housed over 2 million students from across the known galaxy. Its towering spires of crystalline metal pierced the purple sky like gleaming needles, each one representing a different field of study. The Advanced Xenobiology Complex sat nestled between the Philosophy Towers and the Quantum Engineering Laboratories, its bioadaptive architecture shifting and flowing to accommodate the diverse physiological needs of its occupants. Marcus Chen adjusted his atmospheric regulator as he walked through the main corridor, his human eyes taking in the incredible diversity around him. Beings that seemed to defy the laws of physics floated past him on gossamer wings. Others skittered along the walls with dozens of articulated legs. A group of crystalline entities chimed melodiously as they communicated through harmonic resonance. After 6 months on Nexus Prime, Marcus still found himself amazed by the sheer variety of life the universe had produced. The corridor's smart matter floor adjusted its texture beneath his feet, providing the perfect grip for his bipedal locomotion, while simultaneously offering appropriate surfaces for the clawed, padded, and tentacled appendages of his fellow students. Overhead, holographic displays announce class schedules, social events, and research opportunities in over 300 different languages and communication methods. Marcus found Classroom 47, beta without difficulty, the room's entrance expanding to accommodate his human proportions. Inside, the space was a marvel of adaptive architecture. Seating surfaces morphed to fit each student's unique anatomy, while environmental controls maintained dozens of microclimates to ensure every being could function at their optimal level. The room's centerpiece was a massive holographic projection system capable of displaying molecular structures, ecosystem models, and even entire planetary biospheres in perfect detail. Professor Zillith floated near the front of the room, her translucent form rippling with bioluminescent patterns that Marcus's universal translator interpreted as nervous excitement. Her species, the Ethereal, were renowned throughout the galaxy for their expertise in biological sciences, their gaseous forms allowing them to interface directly with cellular structures at the molecular level. Her 7 tentacle-like appendages moved in complex patterns as she prepared her materials, each movement precise and purposeful. Marcus selected a seat in the middle section of the room, close enough to see the details of the professor's demonstrations, but far enough back to avoid being called upon during his first class. The chair immediately began adjusting to his physiology, sensors reading his bone density, muscle tension, and circulatory patterns to provide optimal support. A small atmospheric bubble formed around his face, ensuring the oxygen-nitrogen mixture remained at comfortable levels. Other students filtered into the classroom, and Marcus found himself cataloging them with the instinctive curiosity that had driven him to pursue xenobiology in the first place. A group of hegemonic collective drones moved in perfect synchronization, their hive mind allowing them to share thoughts instantaneously. Their chitinous exoskeletons gleamed under the room's adaptive lighting, and Marcus noted how their multifaceted eyes tracked every movement in the room with predatory precision. Near the front, a Melodian student sat perfectly still, her crystalline body refracting the light into brilliant rainbows. Her species communicated through harmonic frequencies, and Marcus could see the delicate acoustic dampeners built into her seating area to prevent her natural communications from disrupting other students. Every few seconds, barely audible chimes would escape the dampening field, like wind through crystal formations,
A graviton occupied a reinforced section of the room, his massive frame requiring specialized support systems. Standing nearly 8 feet tall and built like a mountain of muscle and bone, his species had evolved on a world with 3 times standard gravity. His movements were deliberate and powerful, each gesture capable of crushing most other species without effort.
Despite his intimidating appearance, Marcus had heard that gravithans were generally peaceful, their strength making aggression unnecessary in most situations. The Centauri twins floated in the back corner, their energy-based forms shimmering like aurora lights. They existed as pure consciousness within electromagnetic fields, their thoughts visible as cascading patterns of light and color. Marcus found their presence both beautiful and slightly unsettling. Knowing that they could interface directly with electronic systems and read energy patterns that were invisible to most corporeal beings. As the room filled, Marcus became aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Conversations grew quieter, and several species exhibited what he recognized as defensive postures. The collective drones' movements became more agitated, their compound eyes focusing on a specific section of the room. Even Professor Xylith's bioluminescent patterns shifted to deeper, more cautious hues. The source of the disturbance became clear when Karath entered the classroom. The Cronarian stood nearly 7 feet tall, his predatory frame moving with the fluid grace of a born killer. His species had evolved on one of the most dangerous worlds in the galaxy, where survival required constant vigilance and ruthless efficiency. Korath's obsidian black exoskeleton was marked with the ritual scars that indicated his status as a proven warrior, each mark representing a successful hunt or territorial battle. His 6 arms moved independently, each one capable of striking with enough force to shatter bone, while his elongated skull housed a brain optimized for tactical thinking and spatial awareness. Most disturbing were his eyes. 4 crimson orbs tracked every movement in the room, their predatory intelligence evaluating each student as either threat, prey, or irrelevant. When his gaze swept over Marcus, the human felt the unmistakable weight of being assessed by an apex predator. Korath selected a seat that provided optimal sight lines to all exits and positioned himself where he could observe the entire room. His reputation preceded him. Even on a campus dedicated to peaceful learning and cooperation, everyone knew about the Cronarian transfer student who had requested placement in advanced courses despite having no formal educational background. Rumors circulated about his past, whispers of military service and darker deeds, but no one questioned him directly. Even the bravest species gave him a wide berth. Professor Zillith's tentacles quivered as she called the class to attention. Welcome, students, to Advanced Xenobiology. I am Professor Zillith, and over the coming term we will explore the magnificent complexity of life throughout our galaxy. Today, we begin with an examination of predator-prey relationships and how they have shaped the evolution of consciousness across different worlds. The holographic display activated, showing a 3-dimensional representation of a typical food web. Species were represented by glowing nodes connected by lines of energy that pulsed to indicate the flow of resources and information through biological systems. The display was beautiful in its complexity, showing how even the simplest ecosystems contained thousands of interconnected relationships. As we can see, Professor Zillith continued, her patterns now shifting to pedagogical blues and greens. The concept of predation is not simply about one organism consuming another. It encompasses a vast array of competitive strategies, from direct physical confrontation to sophisticated deception and tool use. Each approach has driven evolutionary developments that have produced the incredible diversity we see represented in this very room. Marcus leaned forward, genuinely interested. His pre-enrollment research had indicated that Professor Zillith was considered one of the foremost experts in comparative biology, her gaseous form allowing her to study organisms in ways that solid matter species could not replicate. Her insights into the fundamental nature of life had revolutionized several fields of study. Now then, the professor said, her attention shifting to the class roster displayed on her personal interface. Let us begin with some introductions. Each of you will share your name, species, and world of origin. Additionally, please describe your species' primary evolutionary strategy for survival. This will help us understand the diverse perspectives represented in our learning community. The introductions proceeded in order of seating. The hegemonic collective drones spoke in unison, their voices creating harmonic overtones that were somehow both beautiful and unsettling. They explained how their hive mind allowed for perfect coordination and resource allocation, making individual survival irrelevant in favor of collective optimization. The Melodian student sang her introduction, her crystalline voice creating complex harmonies that the universal translators converted into speech. Her people had evolved on a world of living crystal,
where survival required perfect harmony with the planetary consciousness. They had developed the ability to communicate across vast distances through planetary resonance networks. The Gravithan spoke quietly, his massive frame somehow seeming humble as he explained how his people had developed not just physical strength, but also cultural traditions that emphasized restraint and wisdom. On his high-gravity world, rash actions could be fatal not just to individuals, but to entire communities, leading to a society built on careful consideration and collective responsibility. Each introduction revealed fascinating insights into how environment shaped not just physical evolution, but psychological and social development as well. Marcus found himself taking notes, his human mind naturally seeking to understand and categorize the information. When his turn came, Marcus stood and addressed the class.
My name is Marcus Chen. I'm human, from Earth in the Sol system. My species evolved as persistence hunters on a world with moderate gravity and diverse climates. Our primary survival strategy was endurance and tool use, combined with social cooperation and adaptability. He paused, noting how several students' attention sharpened when he mentioned his species. Humans had something of a reputation in the galactic community, though Marcus wasn't entirely sure why. The reactions seemed to range from curiosity to concern, with a few species displaying what looked like wariness. We developed the ability to pursue prey over extremely long distances, Marcus continued, often running for hours or even days to exhaust larger, faster animals. Our evolution favored problem-solving intelligence and the ability to work together in complex social groups. We also became quite good at adapting to new environments and creating tools to overcome physical limitations. As Marcus sat down, he noticed Korith's 4 eyes fixed on him with new intensity. The Cronarian's head tilted slightly. A gesture that Marcus's research had taught him indicated heightened interest in Korith's species. Something about the human's introduction had caught the predator's attention. The introductions continued around the room. An Ixari student explained how her people had evolved sophisticated chemical weapons, their bodies capable of producing dozens of different toxins and pheromones. A Soltharian described his species' ability to phase between different dimensional states, allowing them to avoid predators by literally stepping out of normal space-time. Finally, it was Korith's turn. The Cronarian rose slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute confidence. I am Korith of the Third Spear, of the Cronarian Dominion. My species evolved on Kronos Prime, where only the strongest, fastest, and most cunning survive to breed. We are apex predators, designed by evolution to hunt, kill, and dominate. Our survival strategy is simple. We are better than everything else. The classroom fell silent. Even Professor Zillot's bioluminescent patterns dimmed in response to the raw aggression in Koreth's words. His 4 eyes swept the room, and Marcus could see how other students instinctively leaned away from the Cronarian's gaze. We do not hide like the Siltharians, Korith continued, his voice taking on a mocking tone. We do not rely on poison like the Nexari. We do not need the collective to think for us like the hegemonic drones. We face our challenges directly, with strength and cunning, and we emerge victorious because that is our nature. His gaze fixed on Marcus, and the human felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in those crimson eyes that spoke of violence barely held in check. Some species, Koreth said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried clearly through the room, believe that cooperation and tool-making can substitute for natural selection. They think that intelligence alone can overcome the fundamental reality of survival. This is a delusion that natural selection will eventually correct. Professor Zillith's patterns shifted rapidly through several color combinations that Marcus's translator identified as expressions of concern and diplomatic intervention. Thank you, Korith. Your perspective certainly provides an interesting counterpoint to the more cooperative strategies we've heard described. Now, let us move on to our first practical exercise. The holographic display shifted to show a complex ecosystem model. Working in groups of 4, you will analyze this predator-prey network and identify the key relationships that maintain ecological stability. Each group should include species with different evolutionary backgrounds to provide diverse analytical approaches. Students began organizing themselves into groups, most gravitating toward others with similar physiological or cultural characteristics. Marcus found himself paired with a Xantharan philosopher whose tentacled form reminded him of an earth octopus, a young Altarian whose bird-like features and hollow bones suggested an aerial evolution. And to his dismay, Koreth. The Cronarian had deliberately positioned himself to join Marcus's group, his 4 eyes gleaming with what looked like anticipation. As the other students moved their seating to accommodate group work, Korath leaned closer to Marcus.
"Tell me, little hunter," the Cronarian said, his voice low enough that the others couldn't hear. "How many of your own kind have you killed?"
Marcus blinked, startled by the directness of the question. "I'm sorry? Your species claims to be hunters, yet you seem soft."
Weak. In my culture, a warrior proves their worth through combat. Have you ever taken a life in defense of your territory? Have you ever felt the satisfaction of defeating a rival through strength alone? The Zentharan philosopher, whose name Marcus remembered as Thylix, extended a tentacle in what seemed like a gesture of intervention. Perhaps we should focus on the assignment rather than personal discussions. Korath's head swiveled toward Thylix with predatory speed.
The soft-bodied one speaks of focus while hiding behind diplomatic words. "Tell me, philosopher, what gives you the right to interrupt a conversation between warriors?"
"We're all students here," Marcus said calmly, though he could feel tension building in his shoulders.
The assignment looks interesting. Shall we start with identifying the apex predators in the ecosystem model? Korath's attention snapped back to Marcus, and the human noticed something shift in the Cronarian's posture. There was a subtle change in the way he held his 6 arms, a micro-adjustment that Marcus's instincts recognized as preparation for violence. "Yes," Korath said softly. "Let us talk about apex predators. I am curious to see how well your species understands the concept." The holographic ecosystem rotated slowly between them, its beauty somehow diminished by the tension that had settled over their group. The Altarian, whose name was Skylith, made small chirping sounds that the translator interpreted as nervousness. As they began their analysis, Marcus found himself acutely aware of Korath's presence. The Cronarian made subtle comments throughout their work, each one designed to undermine or challenge Marcus's contributions. When Marcus identified a particularly elegant feedback loop in the predator-prey relationships, Korath dismissed it as theoretical thinking disconnected from reality. When Marcus suggested that cooperation between species might provide stability, Korath laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "Your kind thinks too much and acts too little," Korath said as they worked. "Intelligence without strength is merely elaborate prey behavior. You analyze and theorize while real predators take what they want." Marcus continued working, his responses measured and calm, but something was beginning to build inside him. It was a feeling he recognized from his childhood, from playground bullies who mistook quietness for weakness. A familiar heat was starting to rise in his chest, carefully controlled but definitely present. Thylix and Skylith exchanged what Marcus interpreted as worried glances. Their group dynamic was becoming increasingly strained, and it was clear that Korath was escalating his provocations deliberately. The breaking point came when they reached a section of the ecosystem model that showed human-inhabited worlds. The display included Earth's biosphere, with particular attention to the impact of human expansion and terraforming efforts. "Look at this," Korath said, manipulating the hologram to highlight several areas where human activity had altered natural ecosystems. "Your species destroys rather than adapts. You poison your own world, drive other species to extinction, and then spread to poison new worlds. This is not the behavior of successful predators. This is the behavior of a plague." The classroom around them had grown quieter, and Marcus realized that their conversation was drawing attention from other groups. Professor Xylith's bioluminescent patterns showed increasing concern. But the Aetheral seemed reluctant to intervene directly in what might be a legitimate academic discussion. Marcus looked at the holographic representation of Earth, seeing his homeworld through the lens of galactic perspective. Yes, humans had made mistakes. Yes, their expansion into space had sometimes been messy and destructive, but they had also learned, adapted, and worked to correct their errors. The current state of Earth's biosphere was healthier than it had been in centuries, and human colonies were increasingly designed with ecological balance in mind. "Every species makes mistakes," Marcus said quietly. "The key is learning from them and doing better." Korath leaned closer, his predatory bulk looming over Marcus's much smaller frame. "Mistakes? Your species doesn't make mistakes, little prey. Your species is a mistake. Weak, destructive, and ultimately irrelevant in the galaxy's greater ecosystem. The fact that you're here, in an advanced class, is proof that the consortium's admission standards have become too lenient." Something crystallized in Marcus's mind at that moment. The careful control he'd maintained throughout the conversation shifted, not breaking but redirecting. His posture straightened slightly, and when he looked up at Korath, his expression had changed. It wasn't anger, exactly. It wasn't fear or intimidation or any of the responses Korath had been trying to provoke. Instead, Marcus smiled. It was a small smile, barely noticeable to most observers. But Thylix's tentacles went rigid,
Skylith's chirping stopped entirely, and several nearby students suddenly found themselves paying very close attention to the human who had just displayed his teeth in what every predatory instinct in the room recognized as a threat display.
The smile reached Marcus's eyes, transforming his entire expression from mild academic interest to something that spoke of ancient hunting grounds and persistence predation and the patient satisfaction of creatures who had spent millions of years perfecting the art of pursuing their prey until it simply stopped.
Korath's four eyes widened slightly, and for the first time since entering the classroom, the apex predator from Kronos Prime found himself wondering if he had made a terrible miscalculation. The silence that followed Marcus's smile stretched for exactly 3.7 seconds. In that brief span, the sophisticated atmospheric regulators throughout Classroom 47 Beta registered subtle but significant changes in air composition as dozens of different species released stress hormones, defensive pheromones, and chemical warnings into the shared environment. Korath's compound eyes dilated as his predatory instincts tried to process what he was seeing. The human's smile wasn't the baring of teeth he'd expected from an angry prey animal. It was something else entirely. Patient, calculating, and utterly without fear. The Kronarian's 6 arms made minute adjustments, his body unconsciously preparing for a threat response to something his conscious mind didn't quite understand. Professor Xylith's bioluminescent patterns shifted rapidly through a spectrum of colors that indicated deep concern mixed with academic fascination. As an expert in xenobiology, she recognized that she was witnessing something significant. The Aethral had studied enough predatory species to understand threat displays, and what she was seeing from the human didn't match any of the documented behavioral patterns in his species file. Marcus maintained his smile as he reached across the holographic display, his movements unhurried and precise. His fingers passed through the light-based projection to adjust the ecosystem model, zooming in on a particular section that showed the evolutionary development of persistence hunters on various worlds. "You raise an interesting point about predator classifications," Marcus said, his voice maintaining the same calm academic tone he'd used throughout the conversation. "The galaxy tends to think in terms of apex predators like your species. Powerful, fast, designed for direct confrontation and dominance through superior physical capabilities." He manipulated the hologram to highlight several species that fit the traditional predator profile, massive creatures with enhanced strength, speed, and weaponized natural features. Korath's own species was prominently featured among them. "But there's another category that often gets overlooked in these discussions," Marcus continued, his smile never wavering. "Persistence predators. Species that don't rely on overwhelming force or speed, but on something much more patient." The holographic display shifted to show a different set of creatures. These looked less impressive at first glance. Smaller, less obviously weaponized, almost unremarkable compared to the magnificent killing machines in the previous display. But as the presentation continued, something unsettling became apparent in their hunting behaviors. "Persistence predators don't overpower their prey," Marcus explained, his tone taking on the enthusiasm of someone discussing a particularly fascinating academic subject. "They simply outlast them. They pursue their target over enormous distances, over extended periods, until the prey animal experiences what biologists call exhaustion death. The predator doesn't need to be faster or stronger. They just need to be more patient." Thylex's tentacles had begun making small, nervous movements. As a philosopher, the Zentharum was well versed in recognizing abstract concepts made manifest in concrete form. What he was seeing in Marcus's behavior patterns suggested something that his rational mind rejected, but his survival instincts couldn't ignore. The hologram showed detailed reconstructions of persistence hunts from various worlds. In each case, the predator appeared almost casual in their pursuit, maintaining a steady pace while their prey exhausted itself through panic and desperate escape attempts. The mathematical models were clear. The persistence predator calculated energy expenditure, environmental factors, and psychological pressure with ruthless efficiency. "The fascinating thing," Marcus continued, his smile growing slightly wider, "is how persistence predators use psychological warfare as much as physical endurance. They don't just chase their prey, they communicate their intent. The prey always knows it's being hunted. It knows the predator is still there, still following, still closing the distance. That knowledge becomes a weapon more effective than any claw or venom." Skylith's bird-like features had taken on what could only be described as a distinctly uncomfortable expression. Her hollow bones, evolved for rapid escape flights, seemed to be vibrating slightly with nervous energy. The Altarian species had evolved as prey animals, and every instinct she possessed was screaming warnings at her. Korath leaned back slightly, his predatory confidence wavering for the first time since he'd entered the classroom. The humans' academic discussion was taking on undertones that the Kronarians' warrior instincts recognized as something far more dangerous than a scholarly debate. Of course, Marcus said, adjusting the hologram again to focus on Earth's biosphere. My species represents perhaps the most refined example of persistence predation in the known galaxy. Humans didn't evolve to be the strongest or fastest. We evolved to be inexorable. The display now showed human hunting behavior from various periods in Earth's history. The presentations were clinically detailed, showing how human hunters could pursue game animals across entire continents, following for days or weeks until their prey simply collapsed from exhaustion. The mathematical models demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of the approach. A human hunter could bring down creatures many times their size and strength through simple, patient persistence. We developed several interesting adaptations for this hunting style, Marcus continued, his tone remaining conversational while his smile took on what Professor Zillith's analysis systems flagged as distinctly predatory characteristics. Enhanced endurance capabilities, superior thermal regulation, and most importantly, the psychological ability to maintain pursuit regardless of setbacks or obstacles. The hologram shifted to show human physiological data. Other students in the classroom had begun paying attention to their group's presentation, and the information being displayed was causing visible discomfort among several species. The data showed human cardiovascular systems optimized for sustained effort, cooling systems that could function effectively across a wide range of environments, and neural structures that provided resistance to fatigue and discouragement. But the real innovation, Marcus said, his eyes never leaving Korath's face, was what happened when we moved beyond individual hunting to pack behavior. Humans developed the ability to coordinate persistence hunts across multiple individuals, creating what behavioral scientists call relay predation. One hunter would pursue the prey until they needed rest, then another would take over, maintaining continuous pressure. The mathematical models were undeniable. A coordinated human hunting pack could pursue prey indefinitely, with individual hunters rotating in and out to maintain constant pressure, while the target animal never got a chance to rest or recover. The psychological impact on prey was devastating. They could never escape the knowledge that somewhere behind them, the pursuit continued. Korath's secondary hands had begun making small, involuntary gestures that Marcus's research identified as defensive postures in Kronarian body language. The apex predator was unconsciously responding to threat indicators that his conscious mind was still trying to process. The really interesting development came when humans began applying these hunting strategies to other areas of life, Marcus continued, manipulating the display to show human expansion patterns throughout their history. Warfare, exploration, problem-solving, the same psychological approach. Patient, persistent, inexorable advancement toward a goal regardless of immediate setbacks. The hologram now showed human historical patterns that were deeply unsettling when viewed through the lens of persistence predation. Military campaigns that stretched across decades, with human forces simply outlasting opponents through superior logistics and endurance. Scientific research programs that continued for generations until breakthrough discoveries were achieved. Exploration efforts that persisted through countless failures until success was finally reached. My species doesn't give up, Marcus said simply, his smile now clearly visible to the entire classroom. We don't retreat, we don't surrender, and we don't stop. When we decide something needs to be done, we simply continue until it's accomplished. The atmospheric composition in the room had shifted significantly as more species began releasing stress indicators. Professor Zillith's patterns were now cycling through colors that indicated deep concern mixed with academic fascination. Several other groups had stopped working on their assignments entirely, their attention fixed on the human who was calmly describing what amounted to the most terrifying predatory strategy in the galaxy. Of course, Marcus continued, adjusting the hologram to show modern human space exploration and colonization efforts. This applies to all areas of human behavior. We don't just hunt persistently, we explore persistently, learn persistently, adapt persistently. When we encounter a problem we can't immediately solve, we don't consider it a failure. We consider it a long-term project. Korath's breathing had become noticeably more rapid, his 6 arms now held in positions that were clearly defensive. The Kronarian's 4 eyes darted between Marcus's face and the holographic display, his predatory instincts warning him of danger while his rational mind struggled to understand what had changed in the conversation. The galaxy classifies humans as Class XI2 Deathworlders, Marcus said.
his academic tone never shifting despite the increasingly disturbing nature of his presentation. But I think that classification misses the point. We're not dangerous because we come from a dangerous world. We're dangerous because we never ever stop. The hologram shifted one final time, showing current human population distribution throughout known space. The expansion patterns were unmistakably those of a persistence predator. Steady, inexorable growth that bypassed immediate obstacles to continue advancing toward long-term objectives. Worlds that had initially rejected human settlement found themselves gradually surrounded by human colonies on neighboring systems. Trade relationships that began as minor exchanges evolved into deep economic dependencies. Cultural influences that started as curiosities became fundamental aspects of planetary societies. We don't conquer through force, Marcus explained, his smile now carrying implications that made several students instinctively shift away from him. We just continue. We establish ourselves, we adapt, we improve our position, and we wait. Eventually, resistance becomes irrelevant because we become indispensable. Felix's tentacles had gone completely still, a sign of extreme stress in Xantheran physiology. The philosopher's analytical mind was processing the implications of what Marcus was describing, and the conclusions were deeply unsettling. This wasn't a presentation about biological hunting strategies. This was a description of the most sophisticated form of predation he'd ever encountered. Skyleth made a series of high-pitched chirping sounds that a translator rendered as expressions of acute discomfort. Her species' evolved responses to predatory threats were triggering increasingly strong flight impulses, but the academic setting prevented her from acting on them. The beautiful thing about persistence predation, Marcus said, his voice taking on what Professor Zilleth's analysis systems identified as distinctly satisfying tones, is that it's completely inevitable. The prey can run, hide, fight back, try any strategy they want. But in the end, the mathematics are inescapable. The predator has superior endurance, superior planning, and superior patience. The outcome is predetermined. It's just a matter of time. Karith finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than his usual commanding tone. Are you threatening me, human? Marcus's smile widened slightly, revealing teeth that suddenly seemed much sharper than they had moments before. Threatening you? No, Kareth. I'm educating you. You asked about predator classifications and survival strategies. I'm simply providing a comprehensive answer to your academic inquiry. The Kronarian's 4 eyes narrowed, his warrior instincts finally providing him with a framework he could understand. You think your persistence hunting could work against my species? We are apex predators, human. We are built for war. Oh, I'm sure you are, Marcus replied, his tone remaining conversational while his eyes held steady contact with all 4 of Koreth's optical organs. Individually, any Kronarian could probably defeat any human in direct combat. You're stronger, faster, better armed by nature. But that's not really the relevant comparison, is it?
The hologram shifted to show population statistics.
Human numbers throughout the galaxy compared to Kronarian populations. The disparity was staggering. Humans outnumbered Kronarians by factors that reduced the warrior race to statistical irrelevance. The thing about persistence predators, Marcus said softly, his smile never wavering, is that we don't hunt alone, and we don't limit ourselves to single prey. When we decide something needs to be addressed, we bring everything we have to bear on the problem. All of us, for as long as it takes. The classroom had fallen completely silent. Even Professor Xyleth's bioluminescent patterns had stilled as the implications of Marcus's words settled over the assembled students. The human had just described in perfectly academic terms why his species represented the most dangerous form of predation in the galaxy. Koreth's 6 arms were now held in full defensive positions, his body unconsciously preparing for a fight. His mind knew he couldn't win. The apex predator from Kronos Prime had finally encountered something that his evolutionary psychology recognized as a superior hunter, and Marcus Chen sat quietly in his adaptive chair, his smile unchanged, waiting to see what the Kronarian would do next. The moment stretched like a taut cable about to snap. Koreth's 4 eyes remained locked on Marcus, while the human's patient smile never wavered. Around them, the other students seemed frozen in tableau, their various physiological responses to stress creating a complex symphony of chemical signals that the classroom's atmospheric systems struggled to neutralize. Professor Zilleth's gaseous form pulsed with rapid bioluminescent patterns as she processed what had just occurred in her classroom. Her academic expertise in predator behavior warred with her institutional responsibilities, creating a fascinating internal conflict that manifested as swirling aurora-like displays across her translucent body. Finally, Korith's warrior training reasserted itself. The Crenarian's 6 arms moved with fluid precision as he settled back into his seat, though his posture remained ready for instant action. When he spoke, his voice carried a new undertone, not quite respect, but definitely wariness.
"Your educational presentation has been illuminating," Korith said carefully. "I had not previously considered the mathematical implications of coordinated persistence hunting." Marcus nodded acknowledgement, his academic demeanor unchanged.
It's a common oversight. Most species focus on individual combat capabilities when assessing threat levels.
The galaxy's classification systems tend to emphasize immediate physical dangers rather than strategic long-term considerations. The tension in the room decreased by several degrees, though it remained well above normal classroom levels. Other students began returning attention to their own group assignments, though Marcus noticed that several kept glancing back at their group, with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright concern. Thylix extended a tentacle toward the holographic display, his philosopher's mind already beginning to process the broader implications of what they'd witnessed.
The persistence predation model raises fascinating questions about the nature of consciousness and choice, he observed. If the outcome is truly mathematically predetermined, what role does free will play in the prey's response? Marcus adjusted the hologram to show decision tree analyses of various prey responses to persistence hunting. That's actually one of the most interesting aspects of the strategy. The prey's choices matter enormously. They can extend or shorten the timeline, influence the energy costs involved, even affect the specific outcome. But they can't change the fundamental dynamic. Skylith made small chirping sounds that her translator interpreted as thoughtful consideration mixed with lingering anxiety. So the prey retains agency within constraints imposed by the predator's strategy? Exactly, Marcus replied, his tone warming with genuine appreciation for the question. The prey can choose how to run, where to hide, when to rest, whether to fight. Those choices have real consequences. But the predator has already accounted for the range of possible responses and planned accordingly. Korith leaned forward slightly, his warrior's mind engaging with the tactical implications. This suggests that effective counter-strategies would require either breaking the predator's resource advantages or fundamentally altering the context of the engagement. Very good, Marcus said, and his approving smile was noticeably different from the predatory one he'd displayed earlier. Warmer, more genuine, with none of the unsettling undertones that had made the other students uncomfortable. Counter-strategies do exist, but they generally require either superior resources, environmental advantages, or cooperation among prey species. The hologram shifted to show examples of successful resistance to persistence predation. In each case, the prey had found ways to either exhaust the predator's resources or create conditions where the persistence advantage was neutralized. Most interestingly, the most effective counters involved multiple prey species working together to present the predator with an unmanageable complexity of targets and responses. Of course, Marcus continued, his academic enthusiasm now clearly genuine. These defensive strategies only work when the prey species recognize the nature of the threat early enough to coordinate effective responses. Most prey animals, and most sapient species, don't understand persistence predation until it's too late to mount effective resistance. Professor Zillith drifted closer to their group, her bioluminescent patterns now showing intense academic interest. The Ethereal's expertise in predator-prey relationships made her uniquely qualified to appreciate the sophistication of the discussion taking place. Mr. Robey? Chen, she interjected, her voice carrying harmonics of professional curiosity. Your species' approach to persistence predation appears to extend beyond biological hunting into cultural and technological domains. Could you elaborate on how these strategies manifest in contemporary human civilization? Marcus glanced around the classroom, noting that their conversation had once again drawn widespread attention. Students from other groups were openly listening now, their work on the assigned ecosystem analysis forgotten in favor of this impromptu seminar on advanced predatory behavior. Well, Marcus said, considering his words carefully, humans tend to approach most challenges with what you might call scaled persistent strategies. When we encounter a problem we can't solve immediately, our instinct is to break it down into manageable components and then systematically address each element until the overall objective is achieved. He gestured to the holographic display, which shifted to show human technological development patterns. Take space travel, for example. When humans first discovered that faster-than-light travel was possible, we didn't have the theoretical knowledge or technological infrastructure to achieve it. Instead of abandoning the goal, we identified what we would need to learn and simply started learning it. The display showed the progression of human scientific advancement over several centuries. What became apparent was the methodical, systematic approach, each breakthrough building on previous discoveries, each setback treated as a source of information rather than a reason to quit. The process took nearly 300 years, Marcus continued. Generations of human scientists and engineers working on different aspects of the problem. Some of them never lived to see practical applications of their work. But the effort continued because humans don't conceptualize projects in terms of individual lifespans. We think in terms of species objectives. Korath's four eyes had taken on what Marcus was beginning to recognize as a thoughtful expression. Your species coordinates multi-generational efforts towards strategic objectives? This is unusual among sapient races. Is it? Marcus asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. How do other species typically approach long-term challenges? Thelix's tentacles weaved patterns that suggested deep consideration. Most species tend to focus on problems that can be resolved within the lifetime of individual decision-makers, the philosopher explained. Projects that extend beyond immediate time horizons are usually abandoned or fundamentally altered as leadership changes. That seems inefficient, Marcus observed mildly. Skylith chirped in what the translator rendered as nervous agreement. Human persistence across generations creates strategic advantages that most species cannot match. When humans commit to a long-term objective, they can maintain focus and resource allocation far beyond what other races consider practical. Professor Zillith's patterns shifted to deep analytical blues and purples. This has significant implications for interspecies relations, she noted. If humans view challenges in multi-generational terms while most other species focus on immediate timeframes, the potential for strategic misunderstandings becomes substantial. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. That's actually been a recurring issue in human diplomatic relations. Other species sometimes interpret human long-term planning as aggressive expansionism, when from our perspective, we're simply being thorough. The hologram displayed several historical incidents where human long-term strategic planning had been misunderstood by other species. In each case, human governments had made commitments and allocations that extended far beyond what their alien counterparts considered reasonable planning horizons. The misunderstandings had led to diplomatic tensions and, in some cases, military conflicts. The challenge, Marcus explained, is that human strategic thinking operates on timescales that other species find difficult to conceptualize. When we commit to something, we mean it in ways that translate across generations. This can seem threatening to species that assume all commitments are negotiable based on changing circumstances. Korath's posture had shifted again, but this time toward what Marcus interpreted as respectful attention rather than defensive positioning. Your species' reputation for reliability begins to make more sense in this context, the Cronarian said slowly. When humans make agreements, they are making commitments that extend beyond individual decision-makers. Exactly, Marcus said, his smile now carrying warmth rather than predatory implications. Human treaties and agreements are structured around the assumption that both parties will honor their commitments indefinitely. When other species renegotiate or abandon agreements after leadership changes, humans tend to interpret this as betrayal. The implications were staggering when viewed from this perspective. Human diplomatic and military responses that other species had considered disproportionate or aggressive suddenly appeared as logical reactions to perceived violations of long-term commitments. This also explains human expansion patterns, Professor Zillith observed, her academic excitement now clearly visible in her bioluminescent displays. What other species interpret as aggressive territorialism may actually be systematic resource development based on multi-generational planning. Marcus manipulated the hologram to show human colonial development patterns. When viewed through the lens of persistence predation extended to civilization-scale strategies, the human approach became clear. Each colony was established not for immediate resource extraction, but as part of a comprehensive long-term development plan that could extend across centuries. Humans don't just colonize worlds, Marcus explained. We integrate them into comprehensive logistical and strategic networks. Each colony is designed to support not just itself, but to contribute to species-level objectives that may not become apparent for generations. The mathematical models were undeniable. Human colonial networks showed the same systematic, patient development patterns as their historical persistence hunting strategies. Each settlement was positioned to support larger strategic objectives, with infrastructure investments that only made sense when viewed in multi-generational terms. Skylight made a series of soft chirping sounds that her translator rendered as concerned questions. Does this mean that human expansion will continue indefinitely? That your species views the entire galaxy as prey? Marcus paused, considering the question seriously. That's, a complex issue, he said finally. Humans do tend to view unexplored territories and unsolved problems as challenges to be systematically addressed. But we've also learned to value diversity and cooperation with other sapient species. He adjusted the hologram to show recent human diplomatic initiatives and cooperative research projects. Modern human civilization recognizes that other species bring unique capabilities and perspectives that enhance our own strategic objectives. We're more interested in building comprehensive alliances than in consuming everything we encounter. Korath leaned back in his chair. His 6 arms relaxed for the first time since the conversation began. So humans practice persistence predation on challenges and problems rather than on other sapient species. Generally speaking, yes, Marcus replied. Although, he paused, his smile taking on a subtle edge that made several students pay closer attention. Humans do maintain very clear distinctions between cooperation and competition. Species that choose to work with us find us reliable, patient allies. Species that choose to work against us. He let the sentence hang unfinished, but the implications were clear from the persistence predation models still displayed in the hologram. The classroom fell quiet again as students processed the implications of what they'd learned. They were looking at Marcus with new understanding, not as a soft prey species that had somehow achieved sapience, but as perhaps the most sophisticated predator in the galaxy. The difference was that humans had evolved beyond hunting individuals to hunting concepts, problems, and strategic objectives. Professor Zillith's patterns had shifted to what Marcus recognized as deep academic satisfaction. "Class," she announced to the room, "I believe we've just experienced a practical demonstration of advanced xenobiological concepts that surpasses anything I had planned for today's lesson. Mr. Chen's presentation has illustrated how evolutionary strategies can scale from individual behavior to civilization-level patterns in ways that fundamentally alter interspecies dynamics." As students began gathering their materials, preparing for the end of class, Korath turned to Marcus with an expression that the human was beginning to interpret as respectful wariness. "I believe I owe you an apology," the Chronarian said formally. "I made assumptions about your species based on incomplete information. Your people are clearly far more dangerous than they appear." Marcus's smile returned, but this time it carried no predatory implications, just genuine warmth and a hint of amusement. "No apology needed, Korath. Your assumptions were perfectly reasonable based on apparent physical characteristics. That's actually one of the advantages of persistence predation. Prey species usually don't recognize the threat until it's too late to develop effective counter-strategies." The Chronarian's 4 eyes widened slightly as the implications of that statement settled in. Marcus gathered his materials with unhurried precision, his movements calm and efficient. As the students filed out of the classroom, conversations buzzed with discussions of what they'd witnessed. Word would spread quickly through the campus about the human who had given an impromptu lecture on why his species represented the most sophisticated form of predation in the known galaxy. Marcus was almost to the door when Korath's voice stopped him. "Human!" the Chronarian called out. "What you demonstrated today, the patience, the long-term thinking, the systematic approach. Is this natural for all humans, or are you particularly gifted in these areas?" Marcus paused in the doorway, turning back to look at the apex predator from Chronos Prime. His smile was patient, friendly, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. "All humans, Korath. Every single one of us. It's just how we think." Word spread through the Galactic Educational Consortium campus with the speed that only academic gossip could achieve. By the following morning, every dormitory, study group, and research lab was buzzing with second-hand accounts of the human who had casually explained why his species represented the most dangerous form of predation in the galaxy. The details grew more dramatic with each retelling, but the core message remained consistent. Humans were not what they appeared to be. Marcus arrived at his advanced xenobiology class the next week to find the dynamics had shifted considerably. Students who had previously regarded him with casual indifference now watched him with expressions ranging from fascination to outright wariness. The hegemonic collective drones, whose hive mind processed information with mechanical precision, had repositioned themselves to maintain constant visual contact with his location. Even the ethereal Centauri twins seemed to pulse with increased energy when he entered their proximity. Most notably,
Korath was already in the classroom when Marcus arrived, but the Chronarian's seating choice was markedly different.
Instead of claiming a position that commanded the entire room, he had selected a chair that provided optimal sightlines to Marcus specifically.
When their eyes met, the apex predator from Kronos Prime offered what might have been interpreted as a respectful nod. Professor Zillot's bioluminescent patterns brightened noticeably when she noticed Marcus's arrival.
The Aetheral had spent the intervening week reviewing her files on human behavior and evolutionary psychology, and her academic excitement was clearly visible in the rapid cycling of colors across her gaseous form. "Welcome back, students," she began, her voice carrying harmonics of anticipatory enthusiasm. "Before we proceed with today's scheduled curriculum, I believe it would be valuable to explore some of the concepts that emerged from our previous discussion."
Mr. K-Leg.
Chen's presentation on persistence predation has raised several fascinating questions about the intersection of evolutionary biology and civilizational development. The holographic display activated, showing a complex 3D model of galactic civilization patterns. Species distributions, trade routes, territorial boundaries, and diplomatic relationships created a vast web of interconnected information that took several moments to fully resolve. As we examine the current state of galactic society, Professor Zylith continued, certain patterns become apparent when we apply the analytical frameworks we've been developing. Mr. Chen, would you be willing to provide commentary on how persistence predation strategies might manifest in contemporary interspecies relations? Marcus stood, noting how his simple movement caused a subtle ripple of attention throughout the classroom. Students who had been focusing on the holographic display suddenly redirected their attention to him, their various physiological stress indicators spiking slightly. "Certainly, Professor," he replied, moving toward the display controls with his characteristic unhurried precision. Although I should note that analyzing current galactic politics through the lens of predator-prey relationships requires careful consideration of both historical context and species-specific psychological factors. He manipulated the hologram to highlight specific regions where human influence was most apparent. The patterns that emerged were striking when viewed through the framework he had established the previous week. Human territories didn't expand through direct conquest or aggressive annexation, but through a gradual process that resembled scaled-up persistence hunting. Human diplomatic strategy tends to focus on long-term relationship building, Marcus explained, his tone carrying the same academic objectivity that had made his previous presentation so unsettling. We establish trade partnerships, cultural exchanges, and cooperative research initiatives that create interdependencies over extended time periods. The hologram showed the progression of human relationships with various species over the past several centuries. In each case, the pattern was similar. Initial contact followed by gradual integration of economic, technological, and cultural systems until the relationship became so fundamental to the partner species civilization that dissolution would cause severe disruption. The key insight, Marcus continued, is that humans don't view these relationships as temporary alliances or expedient partnerships. We approach them as permanent integrations that will persist across generations. This creates asymmetric psychological investments that can significantly influence long-term power dynamics. Felix's tentacles moved in patterns that suggested deep philosophical contemplation. "Are you suggesting that human diplomatic strategy is inherently manipulative?" the Xantheran asked. Marcus paused, considering the question carefully. "I'm suggesting that human diplomatic strategy operates on timeframes that most other species don't naturally consider. When humans commit to a partnership, we're making calculations based on centuries of projected interaction. Our partner species may be thinking in terms of decades or even shorter periods." He adjusted the hologram to show specific examples of diplomatic agreements between humans and other species. The mathematical models were clear. Human negotiating positions consistently favored long-term stability over short-term advantages, often accepting immediate costs in exchange for strategic positioning that would provide benefits over extended periods. This creates situations where other species may believe they've achieved favorable agreements, when humans are actually establishing foundations for long-term strategic advantages, Marcus explained. "It's not intentionally deceptive, it's just a natural consequence of different planning horizons." Korath leaned forward, his four eyes focused intently on the patterns being displayed. This explains several historical incidents where human responses seemed disproportionate to immediate provocations, the Chronarian observed. Humans were responding to threats against long-term strategic positions rather than immediate injuries. "Exactly," Marcus said, his smile carrying appreciation for the insight. "When another species violates what humans consider a fundamental agreement, we don't just respond to the immediate violation,
We respond to the implication that the entire long-term relationship is unreliable. The hologram shifted to show several historical conflicts where human military responses had seemed excessive to outside observers. When analyzed through the lens of long-term strategic thinking, the human actions became more comprehensible. They weren't responding to individual provocations but to perceived threats against multi-generational commitments. This has led to some unfortunate misunderstandings, Marcus continued, his tone taking on subtle undertones of regret. Species that view agreements as renegotiable based on changing circumstances have sometimes been surprised by the intensity of human reactions to what they considered minor modifications.
Professor Zillith's patterns shifted to concerned yellows and oranges. The implications for current diplomatic relations are significant, she noted.
If human strategic thinking operates on timeframes that other species find difficult to comprehend, the potential for catastrophic misunderstandings increases substantially. Marcus nodded gravely. This is actually one of the primary challenges facing human diplomats in contemporary galactic politics. We've had to develop extensive educational programs to help our negotiating partners understand the psychological and strategic frameworks that inform human decision-making. The hologram now displayed current human diplomatic initiatives, showing how modern human governments had learned to explicitly communicate their long-term planning approaches to other species. The efforts were comprehensive, involving detailed explanations of human strategic thinking, multi-generational commitment structures, and the psychological factors that drove human persistence in pursuing agreed-upon objectives. The goal, Marcus explained, is to ensure that our diplomatic partners understand exactly what they're agreeing to when they enter into long-term relationships with human governments. We want to avoid situations where other species commit to agreements they don't fully understand, then feel betrayed when humans hold them to commitments they thought were flexible. Skylith made a series of chirping sounds that her translator rendered as thoughtful questions. Has this educational approach been successful in preventing diplomatic misunderstandings? Mixed results, Marcus admitted. Some species have adapted well to human strategic frameworks and have developed their own long-term planning capabilities to match ours. Others find our approach fundamentally incompatible with their psychological or cultural structures. He manipulated the hologram to show examples of both successful and unsuccessful diplomatic adaptations. Species that had developed compatible long-term planning capabilities had formed deep, stable partnerships with human governments. These relationships showed remarkable stability and mutual benefit over extended periods. Conversely, species that couldn't or wouldn't adapt to human strategic timeframes had experienced increasing tensions with human governments. The relationships weren't actively hostile, but they showed patterns of mutual withdrawal and decreasing cooperation over time. The concerning aspect, Marcus said, his tone taking on subtle implications that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats, is that species which can't adapt to human strategic frameworks tend to find themselves gradually marginalized in galactic affairs. The hologram displayed the mathematical progression clearly. Species that maintained short-term strategic thinking found themselves increasingly excluded from major galactic initiatives, research projects, and economic opportunities. Not through active discrimination, but through the natural consequences of being unable to participate in long-term planning efforts. Humans don't intentionally exclude other species, Marcus explained, though his smile carried undertones that suggested the distinction might be academic. But when major galactic initiatives require multi-generational commitments, species that can't make or honor such commitments naturally find themselves unable to participate. Cora's 6 arms had tensed slightly as he processed the implications. You're describing a form of evolutionary pressure applied at the civilization level, the Cronarian said slowly. Species either adapt to human strategic frameworks or face gradual irrelevance. That's one way to interpret the patterns, Marcus agreed, his tone carefully neutral. Although humans prefer to think of it as providing opportunities for species that are willing to commit to long-term cooperative relationships, the classroom had fallen silent as students grappled with the implications of what they were hearing. The human wasn't describing conquest or domination in any traditional sense. He was describing something far more subtle and ultimately more comprehensive, a gradual reshaping of galactic civilization around human strategic preferences through simple persistence and patience. Professor Zillith's bioluminescent patterns had shifted to deep analytical purples as she processed the presentation. The long-term implications are staggering, she observed. If current trends continue, galactic civilization could gradually evolve to match human psychological and strategic frameworks. It's possible, Marcus said thoughtfully. Although humans are also learning and adapting, we're not trying to impose our thinking on other species, we're just being ourselves. If that creates evolutionary pressures towards certain types of strategic thinking, that might ultimately benefit all sapient species in the galaxy. The hologram shifted to show projected development patterns for galactic civilization over the next several centuries. The models were complex, but the general trends were clear: increasing integration, standardization of long-term planning approaches, and gradual convergence towards strategic thinking patterns that resembled human frameworks. "The beautiful thing about persistence predation," Marcus said, his smile taking on the same patient implications that had unnerved his classmates the previous week, "is that it doesn't require force or coercion. The mathematics are simply inevitable. Patience, persistent strategic approaches will eventually outcompete short-term thinking, regardless of the immediate advantages that reactive strategies might provide." He paused, looking around the classroom at the assembled students representing dozens of different species and evolutionary backgrounds. "The question isn't whether galactic civilization will evolve toward long-term strategic thinking. The question is whether individual species will choose to participate in that evolution or gradually find themselves left behind." The implications hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus returned to his seat with unhurried precision, his presentation complete. Around him, students from across the galaxy sat in contemplative silence, processing the realization that they might be witnessing the gradual reshaping of their entire civilization. And in the back of the room, Korath the Destroyer sat very still, his four eyes fixed on the human who had just explained, with perfect academic objectivity, how his species was systematically inheriting the galaxy through simple patience and persistence. The apex predator from Kronos Prime was beginning to understand why humans smiled when they were confident. They had good reason to be confident. They had already won. 3 months after Marcus Chen's impromptu lecture on persistence predation, the advanced xenobiology class had evolved into something unprecedented in the Galactic Educational Consortium's history. What had begun as a standard course in comparative biology had transformed into an intensive seminar on strategic thinking, evolutionary psychology, and the mathematics of civilizational development. Professor Zillith had formally restructured the curriculum to focus on what she termed applied evolutionary strategies in interspecies relations. The Aetheral's academic excitement had never diminished, her bioluminescent patterns constantly shifting through spectrums that indicated deep intellectual satisfaction. The class had become her primary research focus, and she was already preparing papers that would fundamentally alter how xenobiologists understood the relationship between evolutionary psychology and galactic politics. The student dynamics had shifted dramatically as well. The initial wariness toward Marcus had evolved into something more complex, a mixture of respect, fascination, and what could only be described as strategic alliance building. Students who had previously formed casual study groups now approached their academic relationships with the same long-term thinking that Marcus had demonstrated was fundamental to human psychology. Korath had become Marcus's most consistent collaborator, their unlikely partnership producing research insights that neither could have achieved individually. The Kronarians' warrior instincts, when combined with human persistence strategies, created analytical frameworks that were both strategically sophisticated and practically applicable. Their joint presentation on predator psychology and diplomatic negotiations had drawn faculty attendance from across the campus. But the most significant change was happening beyond the classroom. Word of the human students' presentations had spread throughout the consortium's academic networks, reaching faculty, researchers, and eventually government officials across multiple species. What had begun as an academic exercise was now being studied by diplomatic corps, military strategists, and economic planners throughout the galaxy. Marcus became aware of this broader attention when he received a formal invitation to address the consortium's annual symposium on interspecies relations. The invitation came from Chancellor Vexthara herself, a renowned Althurian diplomat whose silver-scaled form commanded respect throughout galactic academic circles. The symposium was held in the consortium's Grand Assembly Hall, a massive auditorium capable of accommodating thousands of beings from hundreds of different species. The architecture was a marvel of adaptive engineering, with environmental zones that could shift in real time to provide optimal conditions for any conceivable physiological requirement. Marcus stood in the speaker's preparation area, adjusting his formal academic robes while reviewing his presentation materials. The topic he had chosen was deliberately comprehensive: evolutionary strategies and galactic civilization, understanding the mathematical foundations of interspecies cooperation. Through the transparent walls of the preparation area, he could see the assembly hall filling with beings from across known space. Representatives from major galactic governments sat alongside academic researchers, military analysts, and economic theorists. The audience was easily the most diverse and influential gathering he had ever addressed. Chancellor Vexthara approached him with the flowing grace characteristic of her species, her silver scales reflecting the ambient lighting in patterns that indicated formal respect. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice carrying harmonics of diplomatic courtesy, "the consortium is honored by your willingness to address this assembly. Your research into human strategic psychology has generated considerable interest throughout galactic academic and governmental circles." "The honor is mine, Chancellor," Marcus replied, his tone carrying the formal courtesy that human diplomatic training had taught him was essential when addressing high-ranking alien officials. "Although I should note that I'm primarily presenting established human psychological frameworks rather than original research." The Chancellor's scales shifted to patterns that Marcus recognized as thoughtful consideration. "Perhaps that distinction is less significant than you believe. The frameworks you describe as natural human psychology represent strategic approaches that most species have never considered. The implications for galactic relations are substantial." She paused, her diplomatic instincts clearly weighing her next words carefully. "I should inform you that this presentation is being transmitted throughout the Galactic Communications Network. Representatives from virtually every major government and academic institution will be observing. Your words today may have consequences that extend far beyond academic discussion." Marcus felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the same patient satisfaction he had experienced when explaining persistence predation to Korith. "I understand, Chancellor. Humans appreciate opportunities to share our perspectives with the broader galactic community." The Chancellor's scales flickered through a brief pattern that might have indicated either amusement or concern. "Indeed, please remember that not all species will interpret your presentation in the same way. Some may view human strategic approaches as threatening." "Of course," Marcus said, his smile carrying the same patient implications that had made his classmates so uncomfortable. "But understanding those reactions will be valuable data for future diplomatic relations." When his time came, Marcus walked onto the stage with unhurried precision, his movements calm and confident despite the magnitude of the audience. The assembly hall fell silent as thousands of beings from hundreds of species focused their attention on the human who had promised to explain the mathematical foundations of interspecies cooperation. "Honored delegates, distinguished colleagues, fellow students of galactic civilization," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's sophisticated acoustic systems. "Today I want to discuss how evolutionary psychology shapes strategic thinking, and how understanding these relationships can enhance cooperation among sapient species." The massive holographic display system activated, showing a three-dimensional model of galactic civilization that was even more complex and detailed than the classroom presentations. Species territories, trade relationships, diplomatic agreements, and resource flows created a web of interaction so intricate that it required several moments for viewers to process the full scope of the information. Every species in this galaxy has evolved psychological frameworks that help their ancestors survive and thrive in their native environments, Marcus continued. These frameworks continue to influence how we approach challenges, form relationships, and plan for the future. Understanding these deep-seated psychological patterns is essential for effective interspecies cooperation. He manipulated the hologram to highlight different regions where various species had achieved notable diplomatic or economic successes. The patterns that emerged were striking when viewed through the lens of evolutionary psychology. Species with compatible strategic frameworks had formed stable, long-term partnerships, while those with incompatible approaches struggled to maintain consistent cooperation. "Humans evolved as persistence predators," Marcus said, noting how the phrase now generated visible reactions of attention throughout the audience. "This evolutionary background has given us psychological traits that emphasize long-term planning, systematic problem-solving, and multi-generational commitment to strategic objectives. These traits significantly influence how we approach diplomatic relationships and galactic cooperation." The hologram showed human expansion and integration patterns throughout their history of galactic contact. The mathematical models were undeniable. Human diplomatic and economic relationships showed the same patient, systematic development that characterized persistence hunting strategies. "The important insight," Marcus continued, "is that human strategic psychology is not inherently superior to other approaches. It's simply optimized for different timescales and objectives." Species that understand human psychological frameworks can develop highly effective cooperative relationships with human governments and organizations. He manipulated the display to show examples of successful human partnerships with various species. In each case, the partner species had either naturally compatible strategic thinking or had developed institutional frameworks that could function effectively across extended timescales. The challenge, Marcus said, his tone taking on the subtle implications that his classmates had learned to recognize as significant, is that effective cooperation requires all parties to understand and accommodate each other's evolutionary psychology. This is particularly important when strategic thinking operates on different timescales. The hologram shifted to show examples of failed diplomatic relationships and their mathematical analysis. In virtually every case, the failures could be traced to incompatible planning horizons. Species attempting to cooperate despite fundamentally different approaches to long-term commitment and strategic development.
Humans have learned that successful galactic cooperation requires extensive education about our psychological frameworks, Marcus explained. We must help our potential partners understand exactly what they're agreeing to when they enter into long-term relationships with human organizations. The display now showed current human diplomatic initiatives, highlighting the comprehensive educational programs that human governments had developed to explain their strategic thinking to other species. The efforts were impressive in their scope and sophistication, designed to ensure that all parties fully understood the implications of long-term cooperative agreements. However, Marcus said, his smile becoming visible to thousands of beings throughout the assembly hall, we've also learned that not all species can or will adapt to human strategic frameworks. This creates natural selection pressures at the civilizational level. The implications of that statement rippled through the audience like a shockwave. Beings from across the galaxy suddenly understood that the human was describing their entire civilization's future in terms of adaptation or irrelevance. Species that can develop compatible long-term strategic thinking find themselves with increasing opportunities for participation in major galactic initiatives. Marcus continued, his academic tone unchanged despite the revolutionary implications of his words. Those that cannot adapt naturally find themselves excluded from projects that require multi-generational commitments. The hologram displayed projected development patterns for galactic civilization over the coming centuries. The models were sophisticated and comprehensive, showing how current trends would likely evolve if left undisturbed. The patterns were unmistakable: increasing human influence, gradual marginalization of species with incompatible strategic frameworks, and eventual convergence towards civilization-wide adoption of persistence-based thinking. This isn't a conscious strategy of dominance, Marcus explained, though his patient smile suggested the distinction might be academic. It's simply the natural consequence of mathematical realities. Strategic approaches optimized for long-term success will eventually outcompete those focused on immediate advantages, regardless of species origin. The assembly hall had fallen completely silent, thousands of beings processing the realization that they were witnessing a fundamental redefinition of their galaxy's future. The human wasn't threatening conquest or demanding submission. He was simply explaining why both were unnecessary. The beautiful aspect of this evolutionary process, Marcus said, his voice carrying the same patient satisfaction that had unnerved his classmates, is that it provides opportunities for all sapient species to participate in galactic civilization's development. The only requirement is willingness to think in terms of multi-generational objectives and systematic progress toward long-term goals. He paused, looking out over the vast assembly of beings representing the diversity and complexity of galactic civilization. Humans are always willing to share our strategic frameworks with species that want to learn them. We believe that galactic civilization will be strengthened when more species adopt approaches that emphasize patience, persistence, and systematic cooperation across extended timescales. The hologram shifted one final time, showing a projection of galactic civilization that could emerge if current trends continued undisturbed. It was a vision of unprecedented integration, stability, and systematic development that spanned multiple star systems and involved coordination among hundreds of species. It was also, unmistakably, a galaxy where human strategic frameworks had become the fundamental organizing principles for all major civilizational initiatives. The choice, Marcus said with quiet finality, belongs to each individual species. You can choose to participate in this evolutionary process, developing the strategic thinking necessary for effective long-term cooperation. Or, you can maintain your current approaches and accept the natural consequences of those decisions. He smiled at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization, his expression patient, friendly, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Humans will continue being ourselves regardless of what others choose. We'll continue building long-term relationships with species that want to work with us, and we'll continue systematically pursuing our objectives across whatever timescales prove necessary. Marcus gathered his materials with unhurried precision, his presentation complete. Behind him, the holographic display continued showing the mathematical inevitability of humanity's patient conquest of galactic civilization. "Thank you for your attention," he said politely. "I look forward to seeing which species choose to join us in building the galaxy's future." As he walked off the stage, the assembly hall remained silent. Thousands of beings contemplating the realization that they had just witnessed the most polite ultimatum in galactic history. In the audience, Korat the Destroyer sat perfectly still, his 4 eyes tracking the human's departure. The apex predator from Kronos Prime had learned to appreciate patience, persistence, and the subtle power of strategic thinking that operated beyond immediate tactical considerations. Around him, representatives from hundreds of species began quiet conversations that would ultimately reshape the political landscape of the galaxy. Some would choose adaptation and integration. Others would choose resistance and gradual marginalization.
But Marcus Chen's smile had made one thing absolutely clear. Humans.